a sound he wasn't meant to hear, a plea so fragile it split the desert silence. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in daylight, much less in the middle of the Arizona wasteland, where nothing should have lived under that blistering August sun. Eli Mathers hadn't planned to walk that far from the chapel that bore his name, nor had he planned on listening to anything but the wind scratching dust against rock. But something in the way the air caught thicker, almost desperate, drew his boots off the main path and toward an old barn swallowed by mesquite and silence. It had once been a cattle shelter, long before the Abernathy land was sold off to strangers and surveyors. Now, it leaned crooked like a dying man too proud to fall. He heard it again, a low moan, broken, human. For a moment, Eli stood motionless, sweat rolling down the back of his neck. The sound seemed to come from inside the barn, too soft to be an animal, too painful to be ignored. He gritted his teeth. He had turned away from many things these last few years: congregants' grief, dying crops, even his own faltering belief, but this was too alive. He pushed the creaking door open. The hinges groaned like a warning. Dust rose up in thick swirls, catching the sunlight in strange, floating halos. Inside, shadows clung to every corner. The place smelled of dry hay, old leather, and something darker, coppery, like blood. His eyes adjusted slowly, and then he saw her. A woman no older than 30 lay twisted in a pile of straw. Her limbs were bound tightly with coarse rope, her dress torn and caked in dirt. Blood soaked the fabric at her thigh, blooming outward in a pattern that told him she'd been left there for hours, if not days. Her hair was matted to her face, streaked with sweat and grime. But it was her eyes that held him wide, unfocused, but flickering with something that hadn't died yet. Her lips moved. A whisper. "Please, don't lift my skirt." He froze. The words, quiet as they were, landed like a blow. They weren't fearful of him. Specifically, it was fear in its purest form, clawing for the last shreds of dignity. Eli's breath hitched. But even as the preacher in him flinched, the man, worn down, hollowed out, saw the blood. Too much blood. The kind that meant something inside was broken, maybe torn open. "I have to help you," he muttered, more to himself than her. He knelt, fingers trembling, as they hovered near the soaked fabric. Her body tensed. He hated himself for what he was about to do, but not more than he feared she'd bleed out in front of him if he didn't. "Forgive me," he whispered. The hem lifted slowly, revealing pale skin marred by bruises and filth. Then he saw it etched crudely into her thigh, deep and raw. She saw too much. The words burned into her flesh like a brand from hell itself. Not just a wound, but a message, a warning, a sentence. Eli recoiled, his hands shaking. His stomach churned, bile climbing his throat. This wasn't just sin. It wasn't just cruelty. It was planned, precise, the kind of evil that no sermon could wash clean. And with that realization, something inside him shattered. The fragile remnants of his faith, already thinned by years of drought and death, crumbled to dust. He felt it go, not with a bang, but like a house long abandoned, caving in upon itself. He looked down at her again, this woman left to die nameless, voiceless, and he felt something stir. Not divine, not sacred, just human. Kaya Tozan, though he didn't know her name yet, blinked slowly. Her lips parted, breath rattling. "You? Preacher?" He nodded. "Hoarse. Used to be." He tore the ropes from her wrists first, his calloused fingers fumbling. Urgent. He would not leave her here. He would not let her become another mark in the dust. Not today. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling dry weeds along the fence line. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. And inside that barn, Eli Mathers, who once preached about heaven and mercy, found himself on his knees before a wounded woman with blood on her skin and a message carved into her body. And in that moment, he finally chose to act. Not all wounds bleed. Some scream in silence. And as the sun dipped lower over the Arizona horizon, turning the dust into copper and shadow, Eli Mathers carried Kaya Tozan across the cracked earth, as if cradling a truth too fragile for the world to know. His arms burned with effort, but he didn't falter. Every few steps, he felt her breath hitch a broken, shallow rhythm, and every time, His grip tightened. She weighed little, but her presence carried the heaviness of a buried story clawing its way back to daylight. The small cabin by the San Pedro River had once been a place of solitude, a retreat from scripture and empty stairs. Now, it would be a sanctuary of another kind. He kicked the door open with a grunt and laid her gently on the makeshift cot by the hearth, her body limp but alive. The fire cracked softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. He lit the lamp, the flame revealing more than he was ready to see. Her skin was a map of cruelty, purpling bruises across her ribs, welts along her back, and around her ankles where rope had bitten deep. Her shoulder bore the crude shape of a branding iron, now scabbed and angry. Eli exhaled slowly. He had seen death. He had stood over graves. But this was something else. This was survival in its rawest, most agonizing form. He heated water, gathered old linens, and found a tin of salve made from yarrow and pine resin. As he knelt beside her, he hesitated. She stirred, eyes fluttering open just enough to see him. Her voice was a rasp. "Don't touch the knife." His gaze followed hers to the belt at her waist. Tucked beneath the torn fabric was a small blade, short, curved, with a handle carved in a tribal pattern. "I won't," he said gently. "It stays with you." She nodded, or tried to. Eli began cleaning her wounds with slow, careful hands. She winced, but didn't flinch away. He murmured steady words, not prayers, just sounds, something to hold her to this moment, to remind her she wasn't alone. The blood at her thigh had clotted poorly. He cleaned around the carved words, avoiding them even as they screamed at him. She saw too much. He'd read them once. He wouldn't again. It wasn't a message for him. It was a scar for her to carry, and somehow, he knew she'd carried worse. By the time he finished, the room smelled of herbs and smoke. He wrapped her in a clean blanket and tucked the knife into her hand. She whispered something in a language he didn't understand. "What was that?" he asked softly. "Shiokis," she repeated. "Means you stayed." He sat back, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "What's your name?" She paused. "Kaya. That yours? Or one they gave you?" A faint smirk ghosted her lips. "Mine." He nodded. "Rest, Kaya. You're safe here. For now." Her eyes drifted closed, but not before a final word slipped from her mouth like a stone falling into a deep well. "Mason." It stopped him cold. The name echoed in the hollow places of his memory. Mason Graves. A man Eli once shook hands with. A land baron with a silver tongue and calloused eyes. A man who donated heavily to the church before disappearing behind deeds and whispers. He stood, walked to the window, and stared into the dying light. Outside, the desert looked peaceful, but inside the cabin, a storm had just begun to stir. She didn't need saving, just someone who wouldn't leave. The dawn broke quietly, painting the desert in strokes of soft rose and bone-white light. Inside the cabin, the air still held the bitter tang of pine sap and boiled linen. Eli sat by the fire, his eyes hollow but alert, watching the slow rise and fall of Kaya's chest. Each breath she took pulled a little more of the silence from the room. She stirred. It wasn't sudden, like in the stories where the wounded wake in panic. No, her eyelids lifted with a groggy defiance, as if even her return to the world would be on her terms. Eli leaned forward. "You're all right. You're safe." Kaya blinked slowly. Her gaze drifted from the fire to the window, then to him. Her voice was sandpaper. "You stayed." "I did." She tried to sit but winced, her body still a battlefield of pain. He helped her ease back down, his hands careful not to brush the wounds. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Silence stretched between them like an old blanket, worn, but warm. Finally, she spoke. "My name's Kaya Tozin." He nodded. "Eli Mathers." She let the name roll over in her mind, eyes narrowing. "You were a preacher?" "Was." Kaya let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Figures." Eli didn't defend himself. Instead, he asked, "Do you remember what happened?" Kaya's face darkened. Her jaw tightened. "They caught me," she said. "I wasn't supposed to be there, but I saw too much." He didn't press. "Not yet." She reached toward the leather pouch on her belt and pulled something free, a folded piece of worn paper, blood-speckled, but intact. Eli took it gently, unfolded it. It was a land deed. The signature at the bottom had been forged badly. They killed Abernathy, Kaya said, her voice flat. Made it look like suicide. I saw the real papers. Mason's men are forging deeds, stealing Apache land to sell to the rail company. Eli's stomach turned. Kaya's fingers gripped the blanket. They branded me with his mark, like I was nothing. He looked at her shoulder, where the scarred M still glowed in angry red. Why didn't you run? She looked him dead in the eye. Where would I go? My people see me as half-blood. The whites see me as a threat. That barn was the only place I could crawl to. Eli didn't have words. Just rage, a slow, burning thing that settled deep in his bones. Kaya tilted her head. You know him, don't you? Mason. Eli's mouth went dry. He remembered the handshake, the donation. The Sunday Mason stood in the third pew with a smile that never reached his eyes. I shook that man's hand in God's house, Eli said. Told him he was welcome in our flock. Kaya didn't respond. The silence turned sharp. After a long moment, Eli stood and walked to the fireplace. He added a log, sparks rising like fireflies. The flames caught fast, licking at the dry bark. He spoke without turning. I can't preach forgiveness anymore. Kaya. I didn't ask you to. He turned back to her. But I can do something else. She raised an eyebrow. I can stay. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, just a shade. And that, Eli thought, was enough for now. Outside, the wind stirred the dust. The day was warming, but inside the cabin, a new kind of fire had begun to burn, quiet, steady, and undeniable. Faith doesn't live in words, it burns in what we choose to do. The fire in the hearth crackled low, casting golden flickers across the worn wooden walls of the cabin. Dust danced lazily in the morning light, and outside, the desert had yet to stir. Eli moved with quiet purpose, boiling water, crushing herbs, rinsing blood from his only good cloths. Kaya lay propped against the wall, her breath steadier now, her eyes watching him. She hadn't spoken since dawn, but he felt the weight of her attention with every movement. He cleaned the blade she kept at her side, never touching the edge, only the hilt. Its curved form bore markings he couldn't read, but he treated it like scripture, reverently, without question. When he brought her broth, she took it without a word. But when their hands touched briefly, she didn't pull away. They were learning each other in silences. Eli didn't preach anymore. He didn't talk about sin, or forgiveness, or heaven. Those things had dried up somewhere between the graves he dug and the blood he'd seen spilled over land that no longer belonged to the living. But he did things. He washed Kaya's wounds twice a day. He heated stones to warm her blanket at night. He chopped wood and reinforced the cabin door. He kept her knife sharpened and near. And every morning, he sat outside with his rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. Not to fear it, but to be ready. Kaya noticed. You don't pray, she said, one afternoon as he changed her dressings. Number. You used to? He nodded. She let the silence stretch. Then, and now? He looked at the angry red mark on her shoulder, the one shaped like a branded M. Now, he said slowly, I just do what needs doing. She accepted that. That evening, Kaya moved to sit beside him near the fire. Her movements were slow, stiff, but deliberate. She held the broth in both hands, the steam curling up between them. She glanced sideways at him. My mother was Apache, she said. My father didn't stay. Eli didn't respond, but he listened. They say I walk between worlds. Too dark for the whites, too pale for the tribe. Mason saw me as neither, just useful, disposable. She looked into the fire. They tied me up like livestock, said they'd bury me in silence. Eli stared at the flames, too. They didn't. Her eyes met his. Number. You didn't let them. He nodded. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in orange light and the ache of things that wouldn't go away. When Kaya finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. Do you believe in justice, Eli? I don't know anymore. She shifted her weight, the fire reflecting off the scar on her cheek. I do, but it's not handed down. It's taken. He didn't argue. That night, as she lay sleeping, Eli stayed by the fire. He didn't read his Bible, didn't speak a word, just sat, watching the embers glow. The wind outside whispered across the desert, and deep inside himself, something stirred a promise. Not to God, not even to Kaya, but to the truth carved into her skin, to the blood soaked into the floorboards. He would not let it be in vain. Sometimes the bravest thing is just to stay. Evening settled over the desert like a soft shroud, cooling the blistered earth and painting the sky in bruised purples and dying gold. The cabin glowed with a steady warmth, the hearth alive with firelight, the scent of simmering stew curling into the rafters. Eli sat at the small table, methodically oiling the bore of his rifle. His movements were slow, deliberate. The act wasn't about readiness, it was about presence. Every sound of the cloth against metal grounded him. Every breath was counted. Across the room, Kaya stirred the pot with a wooden spoon. Her movements were careful but fluid, her limp less noticeable now. Her eyes, once fogged with pain, now followed Eli's hands with silent focus. She spoke without looking up. "Is it hard to focus?" The question was quiet, soft, but it cut through the cabin's hush like a blade. Eli paused, cloth in mid-motion. Kaya turned to face him fully. "With me here, with everything that's happened." He met her gaze. The fire caught in her eyes, reflecting not fear, but curiosity. Depth? He set the rifle down gently on the table, the wood thunking softly against the grain. "You make it seem easy to forget everything," he said. His voice surprised even himself, rough, with honesty he hadn't dared speak aloud. Kaya didn't smile, but something in her shifted, softened. Eli stood, slowly, not like a soldier or a preacher, but like a man stepping across a line he hadn't realized was there. He crossed the small space between them. She didn't move, didn't flinch. His hand reached up, cupping her jaw gently. His thumb brushed the faint scar just above her temple. Her skin was warm, real, and in her eyes, he didn't see a victim. He saw a woman who had endured more than most men could imagine and had come out standing. Their breaths mingled in the air between them. Close, tangled, not rushed, but undeniable. Then, without a sound, Kaya leaned into his touch. They stood like that, two souls no longer hiding, no longer performing for a world that had tried to discard them. A sharp wind blew against the windows, rattling them in their frames. Eli's eyes shifted, narrowing toward the sound. From the corner of the window, a thin veil of dust swept across the plain. At first, it seemed like nothing. But then he saw the unmistakable silhouettes of 3 riders, moving fast across the ridge. Dust curled in their wake like smoke from a fire long smoldering. Eli stepped back, his hand falling away from Kaya's face. He moved to the door, eyes squinting. 3 men, 3 horses, and a storm that had finally found them. Behind him, Kaya's fingers curled around the hilt of her blade. No words were spoken, but they both knew. The silence was about to end. Peace is a brittle thing, it cracks before it breaks. The wind carried it first, a distant thunder that wasn't thunder. Then came the dust, rising in swirling plumes behind the horses as they descended from the ridge, 3 riders dark against the bleeding sky. Eli watched from the porch, rifle in hand, boots planted firm on the creaking boards. He didn't blink, didn't breathe, just counted heartbeats between hoofbeats. Behind him, Kaya stepped into the doorway, blade strapped to her thigh. Her hair was pulled back now, her face calm, but her eyes, they burned. "They found us," she said. Eli didn't answer. He didn't have to. The men rode hard and mean. The lead rider, Clyde Parsons, wore a low-brimmed hat and a sneer that stretched wider than his mouth. To his right, Reed Dalton sat tall and silent, his lean frame stiff with purpose. The third man was broader, heavier, a slab of muscle and rage named Bo McAllister. 3 hounds of Graves. Clyde pulled up first, his horse kicking up dust in thick bursts. His voice cut through the stillness like a saw. "Anabeth Cole," he drawled, loud enough for God and coyotes to hear. "Mason wants his pound of flesh." Eli stepped forward, rifle raised but not aimed. "She's not here." Clyde laughed, spitting to the side. "That so, preacher?" Mason thinks different. The rifle felt light in Eli's hands. Too light for the weight of what was coming. Ree moved his horse slowly, circling wide to the left. Bo dismounted, cracking his knuckles like he was about to fix a fence. "Last warning," Eli said. "No," Clyde said, drawing his pistol. "This is ours." The shot cracked first from Clyde's hand, missing Eli's boots by inches. Dust flew. Eli didn't flinch. His response came swift and clean. The rifle barked once, loud as judgment. Clyde's chest bloomed red. He was yanked back from the saddle like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He hit the ground hard. Still, quiet. The first wolf had fallen. Kaya was already gone from the doorway, moved like shadow into the cabin's rear. She knew this land better than they did. Knew where the light failed and where sound died. Ree cursed, spurring his horse around the cabin in a flanking arc. Bo roared and charged up the porch. Eli turned to face him. The rifle was empty. There wouldn't be time to reload. Bo hit the steps like a storm, and Eli met him head-on. They crashed together in a violent tangle, fists and bone and fury. The porch boards groaned beneath them, dust kicking up in clouds. Eli ducked a wild swing, drove a knee into Bo's ribs. But the man barely grunted. He was a wall of hate and muscle. And he wasn't stopping. Inside the cabin, the stew still simmered on the stove. Outside, the desert held its breath. And from somewhere behind the cabin, another sound rose softer than gunfire, but just as final. A wet, choking gasp. The second wolf had found his fate. But Eli had no time to think. Bo's hand closed around his throat. A woman who survives learns to strike first. Ree Dalton didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in silence. In the way it creeps around your boots when you're somewhere you don't belong. And this silence, thick, unnatural, was starting to itch under his skin. He dismounted near the rear of the cabin, thinking to catch them from behind. Clyde had gone down too easy. That preacher was faster than expected. And now the big man, Bo, was up front, making noise enough to wake the dead. Ree moved slow, revolver drawn, feet soft on the dust. He stepped around a cactus bloom, pausing near the cabin's corner. Nothing but the wind. Then just a whisper of movement. A flicker, not from ahead, but behind him. He turned. Too late. Kaya moved like shadow, low and fast, the blade already in motion. It caught the moonlight just once before sinking deep into his throat. The sound that followed wasn't a scream. It was a gurgle, wet, final. Ree's hands went up, clawing at nothing, his gun falling uselessly to the ground. Kaya held the blade firm, her eyes locked with his, expression cold as the steel in her hand. He fell to his knees. She leaned in, whispered something in Apache. Guzhuo, peace. Then she twisted the knife once and pulled it free. Ree collapsed, a thud swallowed by sand. Kaya wiped the blade on his coat. Her breath was steady. Her hands did not shake. She looked toward the cabin. The porch creaked. The fight up front had grown louder grunts, crashes, snarled curses. Bo was still standing. Eli was still breathing. For now, Kaya slipped back into the shadows, hugging the side of the cabin, moving like she'd done it all her life. This wasn't defense anymore. This was war. She paused at the corner, eyes scanning the porch. Eli was pinned, Bo's hand around his neck, driving him against the wall. Kaya's grip on the knife tightened. There would be no third shot. No more warnings. The time for mercy had passed. Sometimes, the holy thing is the fight itself. The porch groaned under their weight as Bo McAllister drove Eli back against the cabin wall, thick fingers squeezing around his throat. The world narrowed, vision swimming, lungs burning, muscles screaming. Eli grasped at Bo's wrist, kicked out, struggled, but the man was too strong, too fueled by rage. "You killed Clyde," Bo growled, spit flying. "You're gonna pray your way out of this, preacher?" Eli's eyes bulged. His feet scraped uselessly at the floor. Then instinct, desperation. His thumb found Bo's eye. He jabbed. Bo howled, stumbled back. Eli dropped to the floor, gasping. The porch spun around him, but he rolled to his knees, caught a breath, and lunged. He slammed his shoulder into Bo's gut, driving him into the wall this time. Bo recovered fast. Too fast. He threw a punch that cracked across Eli's jaw. Another to the ribs. Eli staggered. Blood in his mouth. Dust in his teeth. Pain lanced through his side. But he stayed upright. Bo came at him again. Wide swing. Eli ducked, slammed his elbow into Bo's sternum. It slowed him. Just a heartbeat. Enough. Eli grabbed the back of Bo's head, pulled it down, and drove his knee up. Bone met bone with a sick crunch. Bo reeled, roaring in fury. They crashed to the porch again, rolling, fists flailing, dust exploding around them. Inside, the fire still burned in the hearth. Outside, the sky had turned charcoal, clouds swallowing the last light. Eli fought without thought, without scripture, without restraint, just movement and need. His hands, once soft with prayer, were now claws. He got Bo on his back, straddled him, grabbed his head again, and twisted. Bo bucked, fought, but Eli held on. Muscles straining, teeth bared. The crack came slow, wet, and awful. Then, silence. Bo's limbs twitched once, then fell still. Eli slumped back, chest heaving. Sweat poured down his face, blood from his split lip mixing with dust. His hands trembled. But he didn't let go until he was certain Bo McAllister would never rise again. Footsteps approached light, measured. Kaya. She stood at the edge of the porch, her blade stained, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met. No words. She stepped closer, knelt beside him, took his hand, pressed it to the earth. Breathe, she said. And he did. For the first time in what felt like hours, Eli Mathers breathed. The night was thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and something older finality. No words passed between Eli and Kaya as they stood over the broken bodies. The three men lay sprawled like discarded shadows across the porch and behind the cabin, limbs bent in unnatural angles, faces twisted in the last emotion they ever felt. For Clyde, it was surprise. For Ree, perhaps disbelief. For Bo, it was rage, frozen mid-roar. Eli's jaw ached. His knuckles were split open. The fabric of his shirt clung to his back, damp with effort and consequence. Kaya, beside him, looked untouched by comparison, but Eli knew better. The stillness in her wasn't calm. It was control, a lid set tightly on something too vast, too wild, to be let loose again. "We can't leave them like this," he said quietly. She nodded once. The earth behind the cabin was dry, but forgiving. They worked in grim rhythm, taking turns with the shovel, their breaths misting in the cooling desert air. Each scoop of dirt was slower than the last, their bodies screaming protest. But neither stopped. Clyde went first. They wrapped him in an old tarp. Eli grunted as he dragged the body across the dirt. Kaya walked behind him, carrying the pistol Clyde never got to fire twice. Ree came next. His throat still gaped open, a dark hole that looked too big for one woman's hand to have made. Kaya stared at it a moment longer than necessary before helping Eli lower him into the second grave. She murmured something in Apache low, private, and without ceremony. Bo was the last. He was heavier, bulkier. Eli's arms trembled trying to shift him alone. Kaya joined without a word, both of them straining to pull the massive corpse across the sand. It took twice as long, and neither spoke as they laid him in the final pit. The digging had taken hours. The filling took just as long. Eli's muscles screamed. His spine felt like it had twisted into knots. Blood had dried on his collarbone, flaked on his palms. But he didn't stop shoveling until the last of the disturbed earth was smoothed over. They stood, side by side, at the edge of the third mound. Their clothes were filthy, their eyes hollow. "You think that's enough?" Kaya asked. Eli looked out over the three fresh graves, silent against the endless land. Then he looked down at his hands red with more than just dirt. "No," he said, "but it's done." Kaya nodded, then reached to the sheath at her side. She drew her knife, the same blade she had used to end Ree's life, and plunged it into the earth at the center grave. The handle stuck out, pointing skyward like a totem. "A warning," she murmured. Eli didn't ask for who. The first light of morning began to break. painting the sky with faint strokes of lavender and rust. Birds called somewhere in the canyon beyond. The desert, unaware of the violence it had witnessed, began to breathe again. As they turned to go, Kaya paused, looking back once more. "These men," she said, "they weren't sent for justice. They were sent for silence." Eli nodded slowly. "And we didn't give it to them." He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder not in comfort, but in solidarity. Then, without fanfare, they walked away, leaving the dead to the earth and the rising sun. The cabin was silent, still, a shell of what had been. Eli stood by the door, bag packed, rifle slung. His gaze swept the room one last time, the hearth now cold, the table wiped clean, the walls whispering stories no one else would hear again. He didn't move to touch anything. Behind him, Kaya knelt, tying the flap of her canvas bag. She'd moved through the space like wind efficient, quiet, final. Nothing unnecessary was packed. No mementos, no softness. Except the doll. She paused, fingertips grazing its porcelain cheek. A child's smile painted in another life. Then, gently, she set it back down. Some things belonged to the past, and the past was no longer theirs. They stepped onto the porch together. The graves behind the cabin were already losing shape to the wind. The church in the distance, once a symbol of order and faith, now looked like a crooked finger pointing nowhere. No prayers. No second thoughts. Eli adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "Ready?" he asked. Kaya didn't answer. She just nodded. And they walked. Their boots crunched on the dry path, dust rising behind them like ghost trails. The morning sun stretched their shadows ahead, two long figures moving into a world that didn't yet know their names. They passed the tree line, the last fencing post, the place where blood had dried. Neither looked back. Names were for the dead, for graves. And in Abath Cole, she belonged to the girl who had been left to die in a barn. That girl was gone now. In her place walked someone else. Not saved, not healed, but standing. The land stretched out before them, endless and uncertain. Red dust rose in lazy spirals around their boots as Eli and Kaya moved eastward, the sun climbing slow behind them. They didn't speak. There was nothing to explain, no plans to declare. Just the rhythm of their steps and the steady breath of two people too tired to run, too stubborn to stop. The road wasn't really a road, just a faint track winding between scrub and stone, a suggestion more than a direction. But it was enough. Enough to carry them away from graves and names and the smell of blood-soaked wood. Kaya walked slightly ahead, her knife tucked at her hip, eyes always scanning the horizon. Eli followed a step behind, rifle across his back, hand never far from the stock. They had the look of travelers, but also of survivors. Once, around midday, they passed a man and his mule coming from the opposite way. He gave them a nod. Didn't ask questions, just tipped his hat and kept walking. That was the kind of place the world was now. People didn't pry, not if they wanted to live long. That night, they made camp beneath a canyon wall. A small fire, just enough to warm the broth Eli stirred in a tin pot. Kaya sat opposite, sharpening her blade with slow, even strokes. "Tomorrow?" Eli asked. Kaya looked up. "Keep moving." He nodded. Silence settled between them, not heavy, not tense, just real. The kind that comes when two people have seen each other at their worst and still choose to stay. As the fire dimmed, Kaya lay back on her bedroll, staring up at a sky so wide it seemed to swallow thought. Eli sat a while longer, feeding the flames one stick at a time. His hands were healing, but the ache inside hadn't left. Still, for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel empty, just unfinished. Somewhere out there, graves still breathed. His men might be buried, but the man who started it all, he hadn't faced them yet. And when he did, Eli knew one thing. This time, they wouldn't be running. They left the land behind like two shadows fading into dusk. No farewell, no names carved in wood, no one to remember. And maybe that was how people like them were meant to go, not with applause, but with a road ahead and silence in their wake. Kaya never looked back. She knew she wouldn't return, not out of fear, but because she carried the past with her now, like the scar on her shoulder, like a name buried deep beneath the dust. Eli walked beside her. Not a preacher anymore, not a killer either. Just a man who had learned when to hold on to what's right and when to let go of what's righteous. Neither of them asked for forgiveness. Neither believed what they had done was noble. But in a world where silence had become the weapon of the powerful, survival itself could be a quiet act of rebellion. They disappeared into the landscape, swallowed by distance, by heat, by time, not forgotten, just released. In a world quick to turn away from pain, the deepest truths don't come from heroes. They come from those who stay, those who kneel beside the broken, those who reach out not to save, but to say, I see you. And sometimes, like Eli, the bravest act isn't to keep your faith. It's to set it down, to step into a world smeared with blood and lies, and still choose to walk beside someone who has nothing left to give, except the truth. Not all survivors are saints, but every survivor is a witness. And sometimes, that's all that remains to keep what's right from being buried.